right. Hita Atanesti. Let's check the live stream.
Yeah, I'm checking it.
Oh, and negate. I believe we are indeed live. Biba, biba. All right. Half a day todos hamzu guana huzung. Estige un otro episode Fanachu. This is another episode of Fanachu. Hello to everyone out there. Guahui host Midzu Tatlus in Guåhan Bavakwa. And I have with me here today one of our most frequent guests on Fanachu. Somebody who has been who is a member of Independent Guåhan, a volunteer for Independent Guåhan. She does work with other organizations, including very critically Filipinos for Guåhan. She's integral to the Fanogi Coalition. And in the midst of all of those other things, she is also working towards her doctorate in gender studies at UCLA. And with me today, I have frequent guest and fan of Fanachu, Josephine Ong, not yet doctor, but soon likely Dr. Josephine Ong. Half a day, Josephine.
Half a day, Miguel, and thank you to all the viewers for coming. That's a very generous introduction, and I guess I have been on Fanachu a lot, especially when Manny was still on it, leading, and Manny is a good friend of mine. So I'm grateful to be here and to hopefully update folks on my new work and what it's about.
Oh yes, Hungen. And so, Josephine, if you want to, you can go ahead and get started sharing, but let me just introduce the topic for today. And so Chamorros and Filipinos have a history that sometimes puts them at odds with each other, sometimes puts them in collaboration, in solidarity with each other. But one thing sort of that's very clear about that history, though, is that there's a lot of untold stories, a lot of things that are unknown. And in ignorance of history, sometimes people rely on prejudice, assumptions, and so on. And so what I love about Josephine's work is that it's bringing to light a lot of experiences and stories, interactions between Chamorros and Filipinos more than a century ago, which are critical in understanding the development of the Chamorro people. If you have been a longtime fan of Fanachu and followed Fanachu for a while, then you know that Guam was a place where the Spanish sent prisoners. They sent political prisoners, reformers. They sent convicts too, but they also sent revolutionaries. And so this is one reason why sort of historians have been doing great work around this. And Josephine joins the ranks of others such as Anne Hattori, Dr. Michael Clement Jr., even Dr. Carlos Madrid, to some extent, Dr. David Atienza, who have all been trying to bring the Spanish period of Chamorro history to life. And part of that is showing that Chamorros were actively thinking about the world around them and engaging with the world around them. And one of the stories, which is largely unknown to many people, but we do have several monuments around the island, sort of which connects to that story, is the connections between Guåhan, Filipino revolutionaries, and Chamorros. And so that's why I'm always glad to talk to Josephine to get more into that history. And so, Josephine, por favor, go ahead and get started with your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Miguel, for introducing my dissertation topic. And I think this leads me to also introduce my presentation. I actually decided to do this topic after I spoke to Auntie Malia Ramirez and Dr. Robert Underwood about my previous topic, which is the Mabini monuments. And they asked me if it's always Filipino women on the front lines of solidarity work, why don't you focus on these two Filipino revolutionary women? And so that is what led to the impetus of this project, in addition to the other things I found in the archive that I won't be talking about today, but I'll be sharing in a future time when the dissertation is done. It's still a work in progress right now, but this part I think is quite solid. So today I'll be talking about the first chapter of my dissertation or selection of it, entitled Women at the Battlefield, Tracing the Historical Impacts of Filipino Women Revolutionaries' Incarceration in Guam from 1896 to 1902, and I'll explain the significance of those dates later. So I'm going to go ahead and begin, and I'm trying to save a lot of time for Q&A. So Miguel, please take, I think I said around 12 to 15 minutes before. So if I'm running over time, please let me know as well.
Hongyan,
Okay.
no problem.
Thanks. Okay. So in a June 2021 speech, Philippine Consul General Patrick Elado declared the opening of Philippine Independence Month in the U.S. territory of Guåhan, recognizing the consulate's work with the Chamorro governor Leon Guerrero. Elado connects 20th century Filipino revolutionary sacrifices to 21st century Filipino frontline workers that serve as nurses, restaurant workers, and hotel staff. At the same time, Elado grounds his understanding of Filipino, quote, heroism and valor, unquote, within Filipino workers that live all over the world. In the process, Elado ties multiple temporalities, as in the past of the 1896 Katipunan and 1898 Philippine Revolution against the US, to present Filipino labor struggles that occur in the different spaces that Filipinos have migrated to. Considering COVID-19's global impacts on Filipino health workers, Elado also shows how these commemorations are conducted in a, quote, safe, simple, yet still meaningful way, end quote. However, his definition of security emphasizes frontline workers' necessary, quote, sacrifices for freedom, end quote, rather than their long-term health and well-being within a site of U.S. militarization. And as folks on the Fanachu podcast have talked about, in addition to Notion Chamorro's studies on the Agent Orange and nuclear poisoning in Guåhan, this has long-reaching, intergenerational, and broad community impacts on all folks who call Guåhan home. So I want to open this specific presentation with Elado's statement to consider the various temporal and spatial impacts of Philippine independence from Spanish and US colonial rule. As the Filipino critical theorist Oscar Campomanes argues in his 1995 article, The New Empire's Forgetful and Forgotten Citizens, contemporary erasure of US colonization of the Philippines often maintains its historical practice of global colonial expansion, which we can think about continues in Guåhan today through its current colonial status. So following Campomanes' reminder to remember the political importance of Filipino resistance, I wonder what role do Philippine independence commemorations play in complicating, or could play in complicating, US colonization? So on to this next slide. So to begin to answer these questions, I will trace the stories of the Filipino revolutionaries Melchor Aquino and Segunda Puentes Santiago that are buried within Spanish American colonial archives, Guam-based newspapers, Filipino revolutionary government documents, and Filipino history books. So for the purposes of this presentation, I will focus on Aquino and Puentes Santiago's work with the Katipunan, a Filipino revolutionary society that advocated for Philippine independence from Spain. So the Katipunan was created on July 17, 1892 in response to the Spanish colonial government's deportation of La Liga Filipina leader Jose Rizal to Dapitan. So as many folks know, that Jose Rizal is like a major Filipino revolutionary hero, but he actually advocated for reform, not independence, within the Spanish colonial government. And the Katipunan was different because they advocated for independence. So led by the craftsman Andres Bonifacio, the Katipunan differed from its predecessors' emphasis on political reform. According to the Filipino historian Teodoro A. Agoncillo, Bonifacio also recognized the importance of women's involvement. Together with his wife Gregoria de Jesus, Bonifacio created the Katipunan's Women Unit, which was mainly made up of the Katipunan's current family members to maintain secrecy of their revolutionary activities. So I think at one point this also included Rizal's mom and his sister. And in addition to Gregoria de Jesus and other mainly educated Filipino women. So the Katipunan Women's Unit resisted the Spanish by spying on their officials, editing and writing the Katipunan's newspaper De La Independencia, providing food and financial backing, and taking care of wounded Filipino soldiers. Officially part of the Katipunan's women's unit, however, were more diverse in their class and regional origin. For example, Melchor Aquino, who is pictured here, was an elderly peasant woman from the village of Caloocan. As a medicine woman and recognized community leader, Aquino spent most of her time performing difficult agricultural labor to help provide for her family. So she was widowed at the time as well, while also playing a major role in her barangay or village activities and social matters. So when something was wrong, for example, with another family, she would be called in to help mediate. So after her husband passed away, Aquino continued to provide for all needs of her children. But this changed on August 23rd, 1896, when the Katipunan gathered at Mecor Aquino's house to strategize for the first battle of the Philippine Revolution. The day after, the Battle of Balintawak, which is very famous in Philippine revolutionary history, set off the fires of revolution against the Spanish colonial government in her son Juan Ramos's yard. After nursing Filipino wounded revolutionaries, Aquino continued to look after the sick and provided shelter for Filipino revolutionary forces. However, her actions soon reached the ears of the Spanish colonial government, which spent years surveilling and persecuting anyone who aided and participated in the revolution. Knowing this, the Spanish colonial government immediately found and imprisoned Aquino in Bilibid prison, where she was subjected to an intense interrogation to reveal Bonifacio's headquarters. And here is pictured the old Bilibid prison. There's a new one now. It's still standing, still being used. So the time Aquino's refusal to reveal Bonifacio's location led to her deportation to the island of Guam in September 1896. In Guåhan, Aquino met Segunda Puente Santiago, who was deported to Guåhan for nursing the sick and fighting on the front lines of the revolution, or so is told. There's a rumor that she shot a member of the Spanish Civil Guard on August 30, but this is not fully confirmed. Yeah. So as a result, Segunda Puente Santiago was also arrested by the Spanish government and exiled in Guåhan. So while contemporary Filipino nationalist histories and commemorations do not always remember Filipino women like Segunda Puente Santiago and Aquino, their 1896 deportation reveals that they nevertheless threatened the Spanish colonial government. But 5 years later, another 32 Filipino revolutionaries were exiled to Guåhan, this time by the US military. So this is like after the Imperial Treaty of Paris, which forcibly annexed Guåhan in the Philippines. And it was actually the Filipino revolutionaries were actually starting to get in talks with the Spanish government. So they were a bit confused and angry that they were signed to another colonial power. So this led to the further resistance of folks. Apolinar Mabini was actually for reform before, but he advocated strongly for independence after the Treaty of Paris. But this time with the US. And for that, he was deported to Guåhan in 1901, and I've written my master's thesis about him. You can find it in the MARC if you're interested in reading it. But yeah, so Apolinar Mabini was the former prime minister of the Philippine Revolutionary Government. He was their diplomat and main strategizer. In 1903, Mabini had lobbied US military officials to repatriate Aquino and Puente Santiago back to the Philippines. About 50 years later, the Philippines regained its independence. Since then, Filipino community organizations and the Philippine consulate have regularly memorialized Filipino revolutionaries like Mabini during June, Philippine Independence Month. So this is a picture of the 1961 Mabini Memorial Ceremony. And as you can see, there are women who are unveiling it and are surrounded by mainly Chamorro and white military men. And so I choose this picture to have everybody think about what it means to have Filipino women and Chamorro women be at the source of doing all this labor in very complex spaces and times. So although Mabini continued back in 1960 when the memorial was first created, and today even continues to be a main focus of most Philippine independence commemorations, Aquino and Puente Santiago were also occasionally recognized. For example, in the 1982 Philippine Independence Commemoration pamphlet, Memories of Filipino Revolutionary Support focused on, quote, dramatizing the full liberation of the Filipino and serve as a paradigm of our national unity, quote. And they were saying this in relation to Filipinos that were incarcerated here, including Aquino Puente Santiago. So 8 years later, Guam's Philippine consulate also cited Filipino women's, quote, unique service, and quote, and Aquino specifically, her material assistance to Katipunan in a 1990 Philippine Independence Anniversary supplement. While it is important to recognize Aquino's service, these late 20th century narratives often focus on how Filipino women's acts of care benefit the Philippine nation state, which, as the Filipino scholar Robin Rodriguez shows, maintains the country's vast economic inequality while also heavily relying on Filipino women's migrants' remittances. In turn, the historical and contemporary revolutionary potential of Filipino care work as care for a barangay or community of revolutionaries is diverted into a service of a nation state that does not fully reciprocate or provide for them in turn. Furthermore, these narratives also seem to invalidate Chamorro's advocacy against the US military's systematic dispossession, expansive acts of destruction, and environmental pollution. We also have to think about 1961, 1970, 1980 being an active time of Chamorro self-determination, struggles for self-determination post-Organic Act in the 1970s and 80s with OPIR, Parapada, and National Chamorro. So all these Chamorro histories of like activism and resistance based on like thinking of Inafa Malik as a form of mutual respect and care for like both Chamorros and Filipinos to reciprocate with one another is never fully mentioned. Or even like in a lot of these commemorations, it's not, Chamorros are often not discussed. Chamorro stories of place are like Chamorro, what's going on for Chamorros at the time is not really discussed. So through Philippine nationalist commemorations like Ilado's 2021 address, although Ilado was also working with Lou Leongar, and Governor Lou Leongar was speaking at the time too. Filipino care work has been turned away from Chamorros and towards collaborations with the US empire. What then would it look like to center our acts of care of one another? So this brings me to solidarity organizations like Filipinos for Guåhan, which has combined written advocacy for Guam's legalization with other community initiatives, such as the donating sustainably grown produce to the mutual aid collective Partos Hit, and writing newspaper op-eds in solidarity with the Chamorro self-determination, organizing mutual aid drives, and holding teach-ins and workshops, including speaking on Fanachu. Again, it's been like, I think I've been doing this since 2017. I've witnessed how Inafa Malik influences the way that we form solidarities with one another, considering the potential similarities between 19th and 21st century Filipino women's activism in the Philippines and Guåhan. Interrogating their historical connections and differences as well may have important implications for how we define and practice collective resistance today. So as a founding member of Filipinos for Guåhan, I've worked with other Filipino women to help increase conversations between Chamorros and Filipinos, while also processing the unique colonial and gendered position of Filipino women, most of whom are on the front lines of very dangerous, very like not well-paying industries, except the medical industry. So being a part of Filipinos for Guåhan has taught me that remembering and practicing Chamorro Filipino feminist solidarities and care for one another could very well help reimagine alternative futures beyond that of US colonization and militarization. These alternative futures, I argue, rely on a feminist praxis of vulnerability, not for the sake of sacrifice or servicing a nation state that does not service or care for its own citizens in return, but instead relies on a complex process and a difficult process, I don't want to idealize this too, of mutual respect and care for one another that I think feminist solidarity is in organizations and like just like folks practice with one another. This is something I've learned from Filipinos for Guåhan, I've learned with Independent Guåhan and as Filipinos for Guåhan's representative to the Fanogi Coalition. So just maasay salamat and thank you everybody for attending my talk. I look forward to hearing everybody's feedback, which I so sorely need. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josephine, for that. You covered a lot of ground, and you did it quite quickly too. I thought,
yeah.
Good job, Maulaki Bidamo, good job. And so one question that has come up though is how many? Oh, and so we have a comment. Thank you, such great info. Sidus Mase, Hafade Tish, thank you for tuning in. But a question has come up. Sort of, you mentioned the commemoration, sort of the dedication of monuments. Now, how many of these types of monuments can we find on Guam today? And you may or may not want to include the one that sort of got cursed by a typhoon.
Yeah. Specifically relating to Mibini, there's the two in the War Pacific. Um, One was added in 1961, the other was not added in 1964, and then there's the infamous one that was uh, destroyed in 2014, I think. Yeah, the that was in front of the Essen Community Center. And my thesis talks about the tensions about it, so I don't want to get too much into it because that's going to be a long conversation. But yeah, I can talk about it if folks want to, but that was a complex process also because Mabini was disabled, physically disabled. But yeah, the way that he's remembered doesn't always focus on his anti-colonial resistance or his advocacy for independence. So I think that, and the lack of community consultation for from Chamorros, especially Asan's Chamorro families, considering everything they've been through with like the urban renewal and like the reoccupation, that I think also needs to be considered.
Actually, I think it might be a good topic to actually delve a little bit more into that issue of the sort of that monument. Actually, I just looked up real fast some images and sort of this is of say 2015, the statue sort of. And so this is somebody sent these pictures into the Pacific Daily News and said the fate of the statue has been decided. Ooh. And so
it was destroyed before that. But I have a picture of the destroyed version.
And so
yeah, I don't know it.
Oh.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm just looking up the picture.
But if you don't mind, because this was such a fascinating sort of thing, because for me, you know, when I hear, you know, the interesting sort of, we were talking a little bit earlier about how politics works on Guam and how sort of there's still these interesting tensions, or how Chamorros and Filipinos talk past each other in certain ways, right? So for example, you might have a politician who will wear a barong, a Chamorro politician who will wear like a barong or something, and then go and talk about how the rich history of Filipinos on our island. And then that same politician might later make a comment about this, about how, you know, we don't want this in our, why would we have statues for this in our community, right? And so can you just, for people that can't remember it, because I found this to be so fascinating, and correct me if I'm wrong, but did a mayor, was this, this mayor did not get reelected, right, or something? And
so she worked with the Philippine consulate at the time, Marciano de Borja, and he was new, so he wanted to remember. He's interested in history. I interviewed him for my thesis. I'm just remembering what he was telling me about, like how the history. He was just wanting to know and like connect Filipinos to their own revolutionary history. But he worked only with the mayor, Mayor Blas. Yeah, Joanna Blas. She didn't get reelected partially because of this, and because a lot of Asan's Chamorro families were not even consulted in this project. Marciano de Borja mainly consulted with Filipino community leaders, like the folks in Philippines, Filipino community for Guåhan, for example. Filipino community of Guam, for example. And I think there was a lot of like, I think my thesis, I talk about how some Filipinos saw so I guess like I should back up a bit, because the statue was actually like destroyed by a veteran, Shimizu Jesus, and then that caused like us as Chamorro families to meet and talk about how they didn't agree with the statue because Mabini didn't do anything for Guam and they weren't consulted about this. And I think what's important to think about is that Asan in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of their land was dispossessed and like taken from them after when the War Pacific Park was created, and also during the urban renewal. And I spoke to a few folks from Asan, and they were also saying like, you know, like that this possession is like fresh in their mind, and to have like a Mabini statue right in the middle of their community center from the mayor's office, like it's when there's already two across the street, it's a little bit insulting, especially without their permission. And I think one of them asked suggested to me, like, instead of just Mabini, why don't we have a statue of a Chamorro political leader next to Mabini? And I think that's, potential way we can put our revolutionary histories in conversation with one another. They were suggesting like Angel Santos. And I think like even Dr. Robert Underwood told me like he had tried to get talk to the Philippine Consul General about this. And he was like, I don't get why it's so important to have community consultations. So I think that's what's crucial about living in Guåhan and knowing Chamorro culture. Like, getting permission and asking folks and like actually talking with folks is a huge part of how to like really remember and think about the histories, because what folks went through in Asan was very violent, like being forced from your land and like not having access to it, or like having to buy back your land at a price that is like way higher than it should be. That's not fair, and that's not so. But I think for Filipinos who visit the Mabini memorials, it's one of their few tangible intergenerational longer connections to Guam. And sometimes the racialization of Filipinos as cheap temporary workers that you just bring for H2 stuff, or like that you like. I was just walking through Macy's yesterday and I was like, oh my God, everybody's speaking Tagalog. It's like I never left. It's so weird, because I'm like, people in service positions are all like Filipino women speaking Tagalog. I can understand them. And I'm like, but this is Guam, And I think, and that's something I think that feeling of like, being ashamed or being seen as like a cheap worker, not for me because I grew up very privileged, but like for a lot of other Filipinos, that Philippines for Guåhan is often discussed. Like that could lead some Filipinos to do these kinds of commemorations. And I think, maybe it's not just remembering Mabini, it's remembering thinking about how we remember him. And I think sometimes the talks about it's always like Mabini did this, but I'm like, yeah, he actually worked towards independence, so that part is like conveniently sanitized a bit. But yeah, even like some of Mabini's poems like praising Asan and Chamorros is not always fully remembered. I think some folks nitpick on the ones that he talks about how Asan was barren, but that's also because he was imprisoned and he was disabled and got really sick from the food they fed him. So he didn't get to see much of Asan. Like he describes in his diaries, like I literally could only see out my window, and sometimes when he would get free days to go to Iganya. So I think it's also important to think about when US militarization and when those structures actually like shape our opinions of one another. Yeah.
No, and let's thank you so much for your, you're bringing in so much context, which I think the mayor at the time probably should have actually brought out more of, and so on, because let's just watch this real quick. This is from some of the quote unquote protests at that time.
A statue of the Philippines' first prime minister, recently erected in Asan, is causing an outcry from the village. More than 20 Asan residents rallied at the home of Leslie San Nicolas this morning to tell PNC why they want the statue removed. PNC's Betsy Brown reports.
I don't know, but I don't know who's Mabini.
I'm not prejudiced or anything, but who is he? We don't know.
Asan residents upset over the erection of a statue of Apolinario Mabini rallied together this morning, calling for the monument of the Philippine national hero to be removed.
Mabini didn't do anything for Guam or the village of Asan. So why are we going to put him up on a pedestal?
We're not against what the Filipinos want to do to honor whoever they want to, but put it in the proper place or community where he can be honored.
The statue is expected to be unveiled this summer. Residents, however, claim the mayor never asked for their input on the matter and say they weren't properly notified that the monument was being built.
A couple of us went over to the guys that were working on the monument, and we tried to put a stop on it and found out that the mayor was off island.
In place of this Mabini statue, the Asan residents say they'd like to see other improvements in their village, such as cutting the grass in this park or installing speed bumps in the village streets.
Like street lights in our dark areas, fixing up, maintaining the yard. I mean the yards, the government properties, the rivers, because they're really
not being taken care of.
Last week, Asin resident Joseph Shimizu Jesus was arrested after witnesses say he struck the statue with a sledgehammer. While not all the residents who gathered to protest the statue today agree with his methods, they say they do understand his passion.
I think of it as a brave man standing up for our village. If the mayor is so highly, about this statue, she should take it off this ground, put it on her property, and build something for the kids.
The Mabini statue is a gift from the Philippine Consul General's office. Betsy Brown, PNC News.
Whew. There's so much to unpack. So much to unpack. In just that short clip. There is so much.
It's a very complex story too, because it's an intergenerational one. And I think in talking with folks from different sides of the debate, I think it's, as you said a while ago, Miguel, that like people don't fully understand each other, but it's also because of the way that people's histories and the archives are told and how people remember it. So reminds me like Mabini didn't do anything for us, and we don't know who Mabini is. That's like the sad thing is like, there are a lot of there's still like some Filipinos who are married into Chamorro families in ASEAN that are like welcome within the community. So I think it's not fully a matter of being Filipino. It's a matter of like, like lack of understanding on both sides and a lack of like, retelling a Mabini story in a nuanced way even. Yeah.
It has echoes for me of sort of recent attempts to rename villages on the island, sort of to restore their Chamorro names, right? So Maritzo to Maleso, Yamatic to Humaktak, and so on. And the interesting thing is that almost all of the villages were accepting of this, but sort of the villages which have sort of the shortest memories, the shortest histories, because the communities are post-war, sort of, post-war communities, or those were the ones that were kind of more resistant, most famously Agana Heights, in which there's lots of Chamorro names for that area. Tutuhan is one of the main names, although some people said it doesn't encompass all of the entire village. And so people were just upset and said, what's Tutuhan? I never heard that. I'm Agana Heights. This has been Agana Heights my whole life. And so it is, one of those things in which people have very strong feelings, not a lot of knowledge, and sort of react to knowledge sort of with strong antagonistic feelings, right? That's a sign of people sort of with sort of not really being connected to the roots, not feeling grounded in a place. And that's why you mentioning even just sort of the displacement that's very recent in that area is important in understanding that.
Yeah, I think not many Filipinos know that, like, after, I think it was like Typhoon Karen with Governor Manuel Guerra, who was the first civilian Chamorro governor, like advocating for like urban renewal. That was really to recover the economy, but like that led to Guerra buying up a lot of the land that some families still can get to. And like the War Pacific Park worked with Guerra, and they had a lot of pushback. If you look at the meeting notes, there was a lot of people getting angry, and the things they were talking about was like equal compensation. And I think that reminds me of enough of like it's like you need to do something in return, but sometimes that something in return can get real revengey sometimes and be filled with resentment. I think that's sometimes like something folks, I think my advisor Keith Camacho talks about it as a form of like carcerality, but I think it comes from trauma as like a first response, like yeah, people hurt me, but the mechanisms to resolve that hurt are not always there. And I think that's what feminism is so important, why feminism is so important, caring for one another, not in like like a superficial way, but actually trying to do the difficult work and recognizing each other's struggles and like trying to heal traumas in multiple ways, whether it be like through like growing your own food or like or participating in mutual aid drives or like doing an op-ed for a decolonization or showing up at the Fanogi March. I think all these different methods are important in feminism. And I think feminist Solidarities teach us like that importance, which is why I wanted to focus on it more, especially having, I remember when me, Kristen, Jamela, and Rizal were like in front of doing the revolutionary history teach-in with independent Guåhan, and folks were like, you guys are all women, so why are you talking about Mabini and only men? And that's also what led to this project, because I was like, they're right. At first I was a little bit annoyed because I was like, always this question. I've gotten it so many times that I think that's what led me to think about why is it always women? Because it is for a reason. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. And so I do have another question. Oh, first, we have a comment from Muñeca de Oro. She says, Sidus Masi Josephine for providing very important historical context and solidarity. And the question, though, is how many women would you say were sent to Guam? Are the two that you have mentioned the only ones, or were there more? Do you have a sense of how many might have?
Yeah, so those two were the ones I recently mentioned. And then I found instances of like Filipino sex workers and other criminals. They're sent to Rota, sometimes here. It's like hard to find the numbers because like the truth of it is like it's mainly men documented. And I have to do additional archival work, and a lot of that is actually in the Philippines, which is why I'm going back to the Philippines as well, not just to see my family and also to have those access to those archives. And a lot of the sad thing is like it requires that you know how to read Spanish, because those documents are also in Spanish. Thankfully, I am perfectly mediocre in Spanish. I can read it. I can read names and the basic gist of it. And I can tell you that it's like it's definitely a minority, but I think it's also class-based now that I think about, because the petty criminals that didn't have like, you know, money and like resources to be taken care of, like the ilustrados and the revolutionaries who were usually of a better financial background and had like better prison conditions. Like there was one floor in the basement, and Carlos Madrid's book talks about this. They're like one floor in the basement for the petty criminals and the top one where it was nicer up for the for the educated Filipino revolutionaries. So, you know, the documents for people like Filipino sex workers, like Filipino women, are not as available, but these two women are like the ones that are mentioned in the US, in the English archives, and also in some of the Spanish ones as well. And they're mentioned in the sense of like, wait, why are they still here? And the reason why they were still there after the Spanish gave Guam and the Philippines to the United States was because they couldn't actually afford their trip back. You had to pay for your trip back to the Philippines, and they couldn't afford it. So they were kept in house arrest in the Dunca house, which is still in Agana. And, you know, the Duncas are an important family here. And they're now a more Filipino family, but Justo Dunca was originally a Filipino exile as well. So he volunteered to have them in their house, and they were put under house arrest. So part of my work looks at how like house arrest and being stuck in that position just because you couldn't afford a trip back until Mabini actually lobbied the government, US government. But the sad thing is Mabini didn't want. Mabini was refusing to sign the oath of allegiance to the United States, so he wasn't allowed to go back. So he kept resisting until he got really sick in 1903. So they couldn't go back until Mabini signed the oath of allegiance. So unfortunately, they were there for a long time. So I think I've been thinking also about like, what does it mean to have your mobilities and ability to return home dependent upon a disabled Filipino man who's actually just trying to like, you know, like resist that form of like I think it was like, it's like it's really offensive for someone who was advocating for independence to then have to sign an oath of allegiance just to go back home. And because he was really sick and he died a few months after. So unfortunately. And it was a long-winded answer of saying like I think this is also why I wanted to do a PhD in gender studies, to think about women's stories and like gender non-conforming folks' stories that are criminalized and sometimes erased because they're criminalized or not given importance in the archive. And that leads me to my own discomfort when I was being asked, hey, it's always women doing the solidarity work, so why are you guys talking about men? And I was like, my annoyance, I think, was just, mourning and discomfort knowing my own history, not knowing Philippines' own history. And I think also Chamorro women's history has also been raised, although we have folks like Tina Delisle and Professor Soder doing awesome work and like remembering that. So I think it's important to remember that as well and do the work in recovering it.
Oh, definitely, definitely. You mentioned this and I wanted to share it real quickly. And so this is the teach-in that Josephine was just mentioning, Filipino revolutionary history. And it's so interesting because for me this is such an important point, when we talk about sort of our roots and our past and understanding who we are. So many people are happy to settle for really superficial, almost superficial answers, right? Sort of that your passport is who you are, or sort of whatever like America says you are, that's who you are. If we really get into our history though, we can see really interesting, fascinating stories about our connections at this time. But because they didn't really serve the interests of the prevailing powers, they certainly didn't help the naval government. The naval government didn't sort of want that. The Spanish didn't want Filipinos and Chamorros talking to each other, either. And so and then later on it didn't serve anybody's interest because, and especially one thing that's truly unfortunate is historians. Sort of, you look at historians and it still amazes me that you could have so many Guam history books who could have an island that, in the second half of the 1800s, that was filled with Filipino revolutionaries, convicts, Spanish political reformers, and, political prisoners. And then for all of these historians to kind of pretend that didn't have any impact on Chamorros. When everybody, when everybody who was exiled, who told a story, interacted with Chamorros, sometimes positive experiences, sometimes there was negative experiences, but it's hard to imagine that you could have somebody like Mabini, who, with his story, who had been on island for a long time, who had been on island for a few years, was being treated like this for the United States, and sort of Chamorros would interact with him and all he would want to talk about is, Asin doesn't have many trees, or it's kind of a barren place, that he wouldn't talk about anything else. But and so I don't want to, and so I wanted to give you a chance though to focus more on this, because it was such an incredible teach-in. You can watch it. I'll put the link to the live stream of it in the Facebook comments so people can check it out. But it was really exceptional to see the four of you presenting on this. And so did you want to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah. I think a lot of this teach-in was also because of, the Dave Davis case, and Dave Davis saying like, oh, I'm also doing this for the Filipinos. And honestly, I felt like that was really patriarchal, really condescending to assume. I was like, this is just like US colonization over again. White men telling Filipino women and Filipino men, Filipino gender conform, Filipino trans people what to think and feel. And I feel like, there are some misunderstandings between Chamorros and Filipinos. But there's also forms of solidarity, and that's what we wanted to highlight in this teach-in. And us members of Filipinos for Guåhan have been mentored by like folks like Auntie Narissa Underwood and Vivian Damas, who have done solidarity work before. But even before that, there are instances of solidarity, like in the Donka families and the Balting families, sometimes some tensions, even with the Flores family, that I think need to be talked about. And that's something I'm working on in my dissertation, talking about the full complexity of Chamorro-Filipino relations, including in the mixed race Chamorro-Filipino families that were formed through these exiles. And I think sometimes this avowed connection, determination. Oh, I think, is that from before? But yeah. So I think it's important to think about that. And I think like we wanted to concentrate on Filipino revolutionary histories in this teaching to think about alternative stories and that are not being talked about, but also to highlight the earlier histories of Filipino and Chamorro solidarity. And so that's why we began with Auntie Hope and Vivian Damas's blessing and them having worked in Flats and Famalaan And also, I think to really focus on, I think like, now I'm thinking of the other archives I found. Oh, hi! I haven't seen her in a while. Oh, hi, she's so cute. Anyway, so I think like I was remembering like, in Ibanez's Chronicle of the Northern Marianas, he's the Spanish priest, and he was saying, oh, these Filipino exiles keep coming out and partying with the Chamorros down south, and we want to control their partying. And I was like, that's their moment of solidarity, and they're just having fun. Let them have it. But for the Spanish priests, it was like, why are the prisoners partying with the Chamorros? They're not supposed to be partying. So I think there's a narrative that like, oh, Filipino criminals and like the revolutionaries were causing trouble on island, and then the other part of it is like they were having parties every week. So the rich Filipinos would invite the Chamorros over, and they would have a fiesta. The Spanish priests would be like, what is this? Why are they having fiestas? They're not supposed to be having fun. There's probably a gigantic lechon in the middle, and they were just jealous. But these forms of like getting together in community were not always looked upon nicely, and sometimes that means that they're not always remembered in the archive it's written, which is often the archive of the victor, as Tro would say. It's often the archive of the US military or the Spanish. But there are written petitions that go back from like, and looking at the Spanish ones, they're like Chamorros writing in petitions and like in Spanish and like 1900s, like early 1900s, and probably before that. So it's not like Chamorros didn't resist and didn't have written records about it. It's just that for a lot of English speakers, it's written in another language, unfortunately. So yeah, I've been translating some of it too, and it's interesting because the way that the Navy translates Chamorro petitions is also very biased. Like when they say a pueblo Chamorro, they translate it as the town of Agana, and I was like, I don't think that's an accurate translation. I was like, pueblo can mean different things, so I think that also translation, as Vicente Rafael, who's a Filipino critical theorist, talks about the violence of translation. So I'm hoping that my work kind of nuances that, because the translations in Spanish and what we know that the archives, like reading it critically also is important. Yeah.
No, Biba. And so I wanted to give you a chance to expound on sort of the intimacies, sort of you in your presentation, you talked about how, what would it look like to center Chamorro Filipino intimacies and acts of care for one another, right? And you mentioned some things, but I wanted to give you a chance to talk more about that, right? Because it's such a simple but obvious thing, and we often forget sort of that, and this is, I think, part of the problem is that, when we look at our histories, when we look at our histories, Filipino and Chamorro histories are deeply connected. But then there's all of these ways in which we still, in the service of sort of narratives of development, militarization, empire, colonialism, acculturation, assimilation, all sorts of things, right? Whatever, we still separate them out, right? We still separate them out. And so your sort of what you posed in your presentation, I wanted to hear more about that. What would it look like instead of sort of like, you mentioned sort of Filipino nurses and sort of their role in empire and sort of also neoliberal frameworks around labor and stuff like that. What would it look like though if we focus these energies and these relations sort of on care, community, solidarity instead?
Yeah, I think it's not, it's like an open secret there are nuclear weapons here, and that there's a lot of environmental poisoning and sickness, both like mental and physical here. And I think, using like a lot of Filipino nurses' skill and taking care of the island, and maybe paying them, right? Because during the COVID-19, there was that protest because of a lack of a hazardous pay. I think, caring for Filipinos, not just as a labor to like bring in, when you need more skilled laborer, but to also like see Filipinos as a potential source to like care for one another. But also I think like to even bridge like Filipino nurses with like amot practices here, like no lie, like a Tagalog in gamot, so it's not even that one, and gamot sounds about the same. But I think like, even I was thinking of intimacies, like, even in the ways in which like my Chamorro friends from independent Guåhan would actually sit down and talk with me and ask about my family's histories and Filipino stories in Guam. And like the time to actually hear each other out like that, I'm like, that's not something, like not everybody knows about that. We're like having a talk in a coffee shop and being vulnerable with one another, but it's more than what mostly happens in Guam because we're so divided from each other purposefully. And I think like, that kind of care that like folks, my friends like would go through just to like, hear my own traumas. I was just thinking like, you don't have to do that because like, Chamorros have already been through a lot, but a lot of my Chamorro friends, especially Chamorro women, have been like, listening to my stories and be like, how can Chamorros also welcome Filipinos better? And I was really shocked by that because I was like, oh, you're right. That is a part of like, they were saying it's a part of Chamorro culture and part of decolonization to create your own community in that way. And I realized, oh, that is important, like to envision your own future and your own terms in welcoming people and how you do it. And so it made me realize like those moments where it's like, not always an important, not an op-ed, like on the side, we're just having coffee are important too. And, I pay for the coffee. I mean, being of financial privilege, I'm like, yeah, I'll pay for it. But yeah. And, like the times where like, for example, I had vertigo and like some of my Chamorro friends from independent Guam would drive me and I felt so bad because I was sickly. I think they know who they are, but they're watching this. I'm so sorry. Yeah, I think like, and those moments of care, like I think for emotional labor is what I'm talking about here. But like, I think there's, as again, you were saying, like, I think the potential for like more like medical and like physical care for one another and like, what would it look like? I know there's some weird bills about like doing medical tourism here. I'm like, why don't we just like improve the medical capacity of Guam and use like Chamorro Filipino, like, they had educational exchanges for like agricultural knowledge and like even some extent like the priest and like nurses knowledge back in like the 1950s and 60s, even before that 1920s. I found like 1928. Like, what if we did that? Like, like more like nurse exchange, more medical school exchange. There's some of it happening now, but to actually use each other's resources and are on our own terms. And that's the importance of independence for me. I think not Filipinos for Guåhan as a whole does not advocate for specific access because we believe that it's Chamorro's right. But I personally think that independence allows that welcoming on your own terms. And I think that allows for different possibilities between Chamorros and Filipinos and other migrants as well. So I think like rather than like, like I think even like, what if like instead of Filipino nurse tourism people and like hotel, like cleaning up after hotel staff, and the tourists who sometimes trash the place, I think Julia Sotomayor's Magaldayo documentary about Filipino migrant workers really hit me different because I know it happens. Like the mistreatment of Filipino staff in like hotels is a huge issue. And it doesn't just dispossesses Chamorros, but also abuses Filipino women who like work multiple jobs and many of whom like are the carers and parents of Filipinos for Guåhan's members. And this is what we talk about. What does it mean to inherit that history? And even like for some Chamorros to have Filipino and Chamorro like ancestors and relatives who do this work, and like knowing that I think partially motivates a lot of Chamorros to be like, there is alternative to seeing one another besides a source of labor or someone that, I think for a lot of Filipinos, they don't see Chamorros as indigenous. The common thing is like, Chamorros are also Filipino, so they're not indigenous. And that's something I used to believe in too. And I'm like, yes, they're part Filipino. Lots of Chamorros are part Filipino. But if you look at the longer history, indigeneity is not just about blood, it's about intergenerational genealogical ties to place. As Miguel, you have, and like Dr. Robert Underwood and Tina De La have talked about, in addition to other activists. So yeah, I think nuancing that is important. But yeah, I'm so hopeful for the future. I think that I'm just imagining like a school exchange, and what if we do like traditional healing and like Hilot. There's a lot of Hilot here too. I've just been discovering that. I've been looking into like potential Hilot practitioners, and I'm like, there's a lot of Hilot people here. Yay! It's just kind of painful. So I'm like, but yeah, there are those kinds of like sharing of knowledge is here to happen, not what we normally accept or what's normalized.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think I definitely agree. You know, one of the things that I always talk to people about in terms of why decolonization is important, why independence would be so important is what you're touching on there. It allows you to try to sort of dictate your relationship to others, right? Because what we see now is that sort of where Guam is locked into a particular relationship with certain places, and sort of that relationship just gets reinforced. So that's one reason why, for example, despite Filipinos having sort of this critical history on this island, you will still find, you know, some Chamorros, especially nowadays, or others, who will sort of respond to Filipinos as if they are sort of echoing Tucker Carlson talking about Mexicans.
Yeah.
And with like the exact same sort of rhetoric. And it's kind of like, you know, there's a historical tension that is there. But it's always interesting then how people can talk about, how just sort of we can still compartmentalize our existences to that point. And for me, part of decolonizing is reestablishing your relationship in a way which is more beneficial to you, which helps you and your community more. And so I think that's a little bit of what you were talking about there.
Yeah, and I was speaking to my best friend about this. He's Chamorro Kanaka. He was saying, like, you know, you remember his grandfather told him about like how there used to be ships that would take you up to the sea in a mine. And like I was saying, like, you know, back in before the Spanish even came, Chamorros and Filipinos were doing that. They were already like, and I'm like, the goods would be so much cheaper. Our rice would be cheaper. We would have good lechon. Like it doesn't take so long. So, you know, like I think this militarized mapping of place also automatically enforces Guam to rely on the US, like through the Jones Act and stuff, when goods could be cheaper, like small businesses could have more profits if they actually like reduce the cost of production through like importing from Asia and like building those trade relations. And, you know, I think sometimes seeing Filipinos as just like H2 workers. And I remember talking to someone about this. I'm like, when does like Chamorro sovereignty become connected to how many H2 workers you can import their people? You know, they're not just like, they're not like a lumber thing, they're people. And that's kind of sad when even that narrative within political advocacy spaces becomes like distills and like sanitizes people's labor into just a commodity. And I think the Philippine nation state gains from that, but also like the US and like economic elites in Guam gain from that. And it's really sad to see that because there are a lot of difficulties in H2 workers' lives here too, and a lot of difficulties in like Filipino workers and like especially like COFA migrants as well. So I think, you know, like, and what's hard is like, you know, it's not like Chamorros are related to some of those Filipinos either. So that could be your cousin or your mom or your grandma too. And I think sometimes it's funny how that is remembered or not remembered. Yeah.
No, definitely. I think, just sort of looking to the future of this, because, you know, one thing that I've noticed, speaking to what you said, sort of about perceptions that Chamorros have of Filipinos, Filipinos have of Chamorros. I mean, I like you said, I still encounter some Filipinos who think that Chamorros don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of one of those things where it speaks to sort of in all of the way, you know, and that's one of the funny things, right? Is that the Dave Davis rhetoric about how this is America and we're all equal doesn't actually bring us together. It actually sort of has a way of keeping us segregated.
Yeah.
But sort of in the name of sort of the United States, US exceptionalism, imperialism, interests, and so on. But we see that it actually hasn't brought the community closer together in those ways.
Yeah.
In fact, you see communities that are so distinct because instead of kind of trying to build a community in which we are connected to this place, we have different stories. We have different stories, we have different experiences, but this is our home. You know, we kind of just rely on the same old narratives and the same old stereotypes. And so it sort of I wanted you to offer some closing remarks to that, because in talking to you over the years, seeing your work progress, I see the connections in the past, but I also see, and I hope for the possibilities in the future, sort of that more Chamorros, as they embrace their critical path, that they can also see that Filipinos have the same sort of past, the same movements, the same drives, and those things can connect us. And so your final thoughts.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is understanding each other's histories and like the ties to place. I think I'm trained in indigenous feminisms and feminist cartography. So I've been trained to think about like stories of place, but like experiencing and knowing more about Guåhan's land and waters beyond seeing it as just like a stepping stone to the continent, which I used to think up until quite recently, actually. So I was in college and realized, oh hell, it's not as great here. But actually knowing about Chamorro stories of place, like like knowing about Gapang and Asan, knowing about learning like how to navigate the boonies, just like instead of being fearful of it. Nowadays, I think I'm too old and like allergic to a lot of things. I just look from the side, I'm like, nice. But like I think a lot of like even Filipinos for Guåhan, like folks like Tabby regularly go to the beach, like, and I think like living off the land, not seeing as just like, oh, I'm stuck here until I get something else better for Filipinos, but like building that relation, knowing that Chamorros have like farmed this land, like fished for generations, and it can provide sustenance for one another also, I think is so important. And remembering that history and also practicing and ensuring that those initiatives and practices continue is important, which is why I personally invest my time in the Fanachu Coalition and also the Philippines for Guåhan, and supports a lot of different initiatives like Partos Hit, like Guåhan Sustainable Culture. We're currently co-producing Rizal's film, It's Halo Halo. Please buy a shirt, by the way. I remember that I put this sticky note to say this. It's about a film about Chamorro Philippine relations, but also Filipino identity and the kinds of things that Filipinos buried down. And I think some of that resentment gets lashed out on both sides towards each other when it should be really towards the oppressor. But yeah, I think that's an important thing to build towards, to remember those histories, to educate folks, and to also practice them in the future. Like like I know Kristen has talked about Filipino farms and gardens here in Guam, like, maybe we can have more of that, like shared with one another. I think that's important, and to practice those kinds of stories of place and remember them, so that we don't just see Guam as a military base or a tourist place or a place to stop by, that it becomes a place to stay and to sustain one another and to like actually like prosper and not just survive. And there's so many people that are sick here too, so to care for one another, reduce the cancer rates on island. I know so many people with cancer. I get like, makes me depressed sometimes every single month. I'm like, this is not normal. So I think like to actually like, look for a better future. And I think knowing that security and those better futures don't just lie in the US military. In fact, oftentimes it furthers that oppression. So I think those are my final thoughts. And I'd also like to invite folks that are interested in talking more, like I'm interviewing a couple of folks about Chamorro Filipino relations. So if you want to talk more or have further ideas for me, please let me know. My email is josephineong25@ucla.edu. And yeah, I'm expanding this work further from 1870. I think I'm going to cut it off at 1960 and then to the present, because I just can't do too much. But yeah, there's a lot more of those complex relations, and I hope to present folks with further updates after I actually finish writing this dissertation.
Biba, thank you for that. And I wanted to give you a few more comments that have come in. And so from Cameron Meno, Saina Maasi Biba for this important research and opportunity for solidarity and community building. And also from Cheska Kabuhat, who is taking independent Guåhan shirts and stickers with her to American Samoa, our fellow colony of the United States. She writes, 100%, our liberation is intrinsically tied to the Chamorro liberation. Looking forward to continuing our solidarity and support each other on tangible levels of community care. Oh, si Diyos masi hamsu todos ni Omega, and thank you so much. Si Diyos masi to Hagulokwi Josephine. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing and then your willingness to come on Fanachu to share it. Lulai says thank you too.
Yeah. Oh, and I promised to show Milo. I forgot. I promised to show Milo. He was sleeping, but here he is.
Oh,
Here's Milo. He was on the promotional material I posted.
Oh, Milo made it. Milo made it home.
Thank you, everybody. Sujusmasi.
Josephine, thank you to everyone watching. Adios. Este